Bob Lazar was hired to work on the propulsion system of a craft hidden deep within the Nevada desert. The craft did not rely on engines, fuel, or conventional thrust. It appeared to move by manipulating gravity itself. As Bob worked more closely with the technology, he came to understand that it wasn't manufactured using any known human process. The way it functioned all pointed to something fundamentally different. The project Bob had been brought into involved far more than a single craft, and far more than a single discovery. And understanding how it all fit together would take him far deeper than he ever expected. If this helps you fall asleep tonight, you can tap the like button tomorrow morning. And if you remember any dreams when you wake up, you're always welcome to share them. Chapter 1. It was Bob's first day, and he arrived at the airport with very little to go on. No detailed briefing, no clear outline of what the work involved, just instructions, carefully chosen. Things began to feel different the moment he reached the terminal. Not the main departures hall, but a smaller, quieter area set apart from the rest of the airport. There were no signs pointing the way, no destination boards, no airline branding, just a plain doorway, easy to miss unless you already knew to look for it. Inside, the atmosphere shifted. A small group of people were already waiting. They didn't speak. They didn't ask questions. They sat with the calm familiarity of people who understood the routine well enough not to comment on it. Through the wide windows, Bob could see the aircraft on the tarmac. White, unmarked, identical. Each one carried a thin red stripe running along the side, the only feature that caught the light. Janet Airlines. The name wasn't displayed anywhere obvious. It didn't need to be. Everyone there seemed to know exactly where they were meant to go, and just as importantly, what they weren't meant to ask. Boarding was efficient and quiet. No announcements, no mention of a destination. The crew moved with practiced ease, their tone neutral, professional, almost deliberately forgettable. Inside the cabin, the feeling was different from any commercial flight Bob had taken before. The space felt tighter, more controlled, as though the aircraft itself expected a certain kind of silence. Conversations didn't start. No one asked how long the flight would be. When the plane lifted off, Las Vegas fell away quickly. The city thinned into open land, then into something emptier still. Out of the window, the desert stretched out in muted colors, broken only by dry lake beds and distant mountain ranges that refused to offer any sense of scale. The view outside the window didn't change much after that. Just desert, then more desert. The flight passed quietly. When the plane finally descended, there was no passenger terminal waiting for them, no glass frontage, no signage, no sense of arrival in the usual way. Instead, the runway sat beside a small cluster of low buildings in the distance, their shapes flat and functional against the pale ground. A few hangars stood nearby, muted in color, blending into the landscape rather than standing apart from it. Everything about the place felt practical, designed to operate, not to welcome. The heat was immediate as Bob stepped down onto the tarmac, dry and still, carrying the faint smell of dust, fuel, and sun-warmed concrete. Someone nearby mentioned the name Groom Lake, casually, as if it were common knowledge. Bob noted it. He didn't ask. A bus was already waiting. The windows were darkened, the engine running. He took a seat and watched as the landscape slid past, the road carrying them south, deeper into the desert. The terrain barely changed, but the sense of isolation grew heavier with each mile. Civilization disappeared quickly. First the buildings, then the power lines, then even the subtle signs that suggested anyone else might come through here later. Eventually, the bus slowed. Later, Bob would learn the name Papoose Lake. At the time, it was simply another dry expanse with no markers and no explanation. What stood out instead were the hangars. They were built into the mountainside, shaped and colored to blend into the surrounding rock. From a distance, they almost disappeared entirely. Up close, they felt permanent. Bob stepped off the bus and was guided forward. Security came in layers, identification checks, clearances, a hand scanner that felt colder than expected against his palm. Each step was procedural, unremarkable in a way that suggested this process had been repeated many times before. No one explained very much. They didn't need to. As Bob was led toward the entrance, he had the quiet sense that whatever lay beyond the doors wasn't meant to be questioned, only worked on. He had been brought here to study propulsion. At that moment, he still didn't understand how far that single instruction would take him. That understanding would come later. Chapter 2: The Facility. The doors closed behind Bob with a muted sound that seemed to vanish into the walls themselves. Inside, the air felt cooler, controlled. It carried a faint metallic scent mixed with something sterile and recycled, the kind of atmosphere designed to be unnoticed, yet impossible to ignore once you became aware of it. The lighting was low and even, carefully calibrated so that nothing cast a shadow for long. Every surface appeared intentional, nothing decorative, nothing unnecessary. Bob was guided forward. The corridor ahead was narrow, its walls painted in a muted grey that absorbed sound rather than reflecting it. His footsteps felt distant, softened by the flooring beneath him. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it was deliberate, as though noise itself was discouraged. They reached the first checkpoint. Identification was checked, then checked again. A card was scanned. A number appeared briefly on a small screen and disappeared just as quickly. No one commented on it. No one explained what it meant. Bob noticed the way people moved. No rushing, no hesitation, no wasted motion. At the next station, he was asked to place his hand flat against a smooth metal surface. The scanner beneath it hummed softly, cool against his skin. A brief pause followed, just long enough to register, and then a small indicator light changed color. That was enough. They continued. As they moved deeper into the facility, the corridors branched and folded back on themselves. Doors appeared without labels. Some were passed without acknowledgement. Others required brief stops, a code entered, a clearance confirmed. Bob quickly understood that this place was designed to keep information contained. No one here knew everything. Access wasn't determined by rank or seniority, but by relevance. People moved only where they were needed, and nowhere else. Questions were not discouraged, but answers were narrowly framed, confined to the task immediately at hand. Secrecy here wasn't enforced through threat. It was maintained through structure. Eventually, they entered a space that felt subtly different. The ceiling rose slightly, just enough to be noticeable. The walls were lined with workstations, each occupied by someone focused intently on their task. Screens glowed softly, displaying equations, diagrams, and models that shifted slowly, rotating through perspectives Bob didn't yet recognize. No one looked up as he entered. Bob was directed toward an empty station. This, he understood, was where he would work. A man standing nearby introduced himself quietly, offering only a first name. The exchange was brief, professional, and intentionally unremarkable, as though personal details were something to be kept separate from the work itself. "You'll be working within a defined scope," the man said. "If you need anything outside of that, you'll be informed." Bob nodded. The explanation wasn't unfriendly. It simply wasn't open to interpretation. He was handed a thin folder. Inside, the information was sparse. No background history, no discussion of origins, no broader context. Just a narrow description of his role. Propulsion systems, movement, observed behavior. The language was careful. Effects were described without conclusions. Data was presented without speculation. Whoever had written this material had taken great care not to imply more than could be directly observed. Bob felt his focus sharpen. This wasn't development, it was analysis, reverse engineering. The idea settled quietly in his mind as he read. As the day continued, Bob became increasingly aware of what wasn't being said. No one spoke about where the technology came from. No one offered theories or speculation. The subject simply existed, unexamined in conversation, as though its origin was either irrelevant or already understood. At one point, Bob looked up and noticed a doorway at the far end of the room. It was wider than the others, framed by reinforced panels and guarded by an additional layer of access controls. People passed near it without stopping. No one approached it casually. Bob didn't ask what lay beyond. He didn't need to. Time moved differently inside the facility. Without windows or clocks, hours slipped by unnoticed. Tasks flowed into one another without clear boundaries. When Bob paused, someone appeared with quiet efficiency to guide him to the next stage. Meals were brief, functional, taken in small rooms where conversation was minimal and always careful. The outside world felt distant, as though it belonged to another version of reality. Later, Bob was escorted deeper into the facility. The corridors changed again, the walls thickened, the doors grew heavier. The air felt cooler still, carrying a faint vibration that he couldn't quite place. It wasn't loud enough to hear, but he could feel it, subtly, through the floor beneath his feet. He was asked to wait. The room was empty, save for a single bench and a small panel set into the wall. Bob sat, listening to the quiet hum that seemed to run through the structure itself. He became aware of his own breathing. Slow, steady, measured. After a moment, the door opened. He was escorted forward once more through another checkpoint and into a space unlike any he had seen so far. The hangar opened up around him. The ceiling rose high overhead, disappearing into shadow. The lighting here was more focused, directed toward the center of the room, leaving the edges dim and indistinct. The scale of the space made Bob's presence feel small, almost intrusive. He stopped without being told to. In front of him, resting on a raised platform, was the object he had been brought here to study. The craft. It was smaller than he had expected. Smooth, compact, quiet. Its surface reflected the light in a way that didn't behave like conventional metal. There were no visible seams, no rivets, no signs of assembly. It looked as though it had been formed as a single piece, shaped rather than constructed. Bob felt a subtle shift inside himself. Not shock, not disbelief, recognition. This was not something that fit comfortably within the frameworks he was used to. It didn't invite immediate understanding. Instead, it suggested that the rules themselves were different. No one spoke. There was no introduction, no explanation, no dramatic reveal. The craft simply existed. And in that moment, Bob understood that this facility, with all its layers of security and silence, had been built around a single purpose: to understand how something like this could move. And why? Chapter 3. The craft. Bob didn't approach it immediately. He remained where he was, just inside the hangar, allowing his eyes to adjust to the scale of the space and the way the light settled around the object at its center. The air felt dense here, heavier than in the corridors, as if the room itself was designed to contain more than just equipment. The craft rested on a raised platform. There were no visible supports holding it in place, nothing obvious anchoring it to the structure beneath. It simply sat there, balanced, self-contained, as though gravity behaved differently around it. From a distance, its shape was simple: a smooth, flattened form, rounded at the edges, neither sharp nor angular. It didn't suggest speed or aggression. If anything, it appeared neutral, almost reserved, as though it had been designed without concern for how it would be perceived. As Bob moved closer, details began to emerge. The surface wasn't reflective in the way polished metal usually is. Light didn't bounce or glare. Instead, it softened, spreading evenly across the material. There were no seams where panels met, no joints, no fasteners, nothing that suggested assembly. It looked formed, as if it had been shaped as a whole rather than built in parts. Bob circled it slowly, his steps measured, instinctively quiet. The hangar absorbed sound, just as the rest of the facility did. Even at this distance, there was no hum, no vibration, no sign that the craft was active. And yet, it didn't feel inert. There was a presence to it that was difficult to define. Not energy exactly, more a sense of containment, as though something fundamental had been folded inward and sealed away. Bob stopped beside it. Up close, the surface texture became more apparent. It wasn't perfectly smooth, but subtly varied, almost organic in its consistency. When he reached out and placed his hand against it, the material felt cool but not cold. Solid, but without the dense resistance he would have expected from metal. It didn't feel manufactured. It felt intentional. He withdrew his hand and stepped back, letting the sensations settle. Around him, a small group of technicians stood at a respectful distance. No one interrupted. No one offered commentary. This wasn't a moment for explanation. Eventually, someone spoke. Not to describe the craft itself, but to clarify Bob's role in relation to it. He was told that the object did not rely on engines, fuel, or conventional thrust. There were no moving parts designed to push against air or ground. Movement, he was told, was achieved through interaction with gravity itself. The explanation was delivered calmly, without emphasis, as though this were an accepted premise rather than a radical claim. Gravity manipulation. The idea wasn't entirely foreign. Theoretical models existed, mathematical frameworks that hinted at such possibilities. But here, those theories had been made physical. The craft did not push itself forward. It fell in a direction of its choosing. Bob listened carefully as diagrams were brought up on nearby screens. Not traditional schematics, but simplified representations of fields and vectors. Curvature, distortion, attempts to visualize something that resisted easy description. The craft generated a localized distortion in space-time. By shaping that distortion beneath it, the craft could move without inertia in the way conventional objects experienced it. There was no acceleration curve, no resistance to overcome. It simply repositioned itself. Bob felt his focus narrow. This was a problem, a deep one, complex but not chaotic. The kind of problem that invited patience rather than force. As the explanation continued, it became clear that the propulsion system was only partially understood. Effects had been observed, behavior recorded, but the mechanism itself remained elusive. Certain materials within the craft appeared to play a critical role. Exotic, dense, unstable under normal conditions. One element in particular was mentioned, element 115. At the time, it wasn't something that existed in the public scientific record. A theoretical entry on a chart. A placeholder more than a reality. Here it was treated as fact. The element acted as a source of gravitational interaction, producing a field that could be shaped and directed. The structure of the craft itself appeared to amplify and control this effect, its form dictated by function rather than aesthetics. Bob noted the absence of excitement in the room. No raised voices, no disbelief, no sense of discovery. The people around him weren't trying to prove anything. They were trying to understand it well enough to predict its behavior, to work within constraints that had already been established. Over the following days, Bob was allowed to examine the craft more closely. Measurements were taken, tests conducted, hypotheses proposed and quietly discarded. The work was methodical, restrained, almost meditative in its repetition. Bob noticed that no one ever referred to the craft as a prototype, or an experiment, or a vehicle. It was simply referred to as the craft, as if its existence required no justification. At times, Bob found himself standing beside it alone, the hangar quiet except for the low ambient hum of the facility. In those moments, the scale of what he was involved in became harder to ignore. This wasn't a breakthrough waiting to be announced. It was a secret being maintained. The craft had been here long enough for procedures to form around it, long enough for its presence to become routine to those tasked with studying it. That, Bob realized, might have been the most unsettling part. Not that the craft existed, but that it had existed quietly, patiently, while the world beyond the desert continued on, unaware. As he left the hangar that day, Bob carried with him a growing certainty. Whatever this object was, it hadn't been designed with human limitations in mind, and understanding how it moved was only the first step. Chapter 4. Why Bob was chosen. Bob's work did not begin with the craft. It began long before he ever stepped onto the tarmac in the desert, before the security clearances, before the silence, before the hangar doors closed behind him. He had spent years moving comfortably between disciplines that rarely overlapped. Physics, engineering, applied experimentation. He wasn't interested in theory for its own sake. He wanted to know how things behaved when equations were forced to meet reality, how systems failed, how they held together, how small changes produced unexpected results. That mindset mattered. Inside the facility, Bob quickly noticed that most of the people around him shared a similar quality. They weren't generalists. They weren't visionaries in the romantic sense. They were problem solvers, selected not for how broadly they could think, but for how precisely. Each person here had been chosen for a narrow reason. Bob's reason was propulsion. Not engines, not fuel systems, not aerodynamics, movement itself. The way objects interacted with forces that were usually taken for granted, the way mass responded to fields, the assumptions baked into everyday physics that were rarely questioned because they worked well enough. The craft didn't fit those assumptions. Bob was given access to a growing body of internal notes, observations collected over years, test results that didn't align neatly with known models, equations that balanced on paper but resisted physical intuition. The propulsion system wasn't mechanical in any familiar sense. There were no turbines, no exhaust, no reaction mass being expelled. Instead, the craft appeared to generate a localized distortion beneath itself, a controlled curvature that altered the way gravity behaved in a specific region of space. Bob recognized the theory immediately, not because it was proven, but because it had always lingered on the edges of possibility. Gravity as geometry, space-time not as a stage, but as an active participant. The craft didn't push against the world, it reshaped it. Bob began working through the problem the way he always did, slowly, carefully, by isolating variables and refusing to assume anything without reason. Why this shape? Why this material? Why did the field behave differently near certain surfaces? The answers didn't come quickly. Some days they didn't come at all. But occasionally, patterns emerged, subtle relationships between form and function, clues that suggested the craft had been designed with an understanding of physics that went deeper than anything Bob had encountered before. He wasn't told where the craft came from. He didn't need to be. The design itself spoke clearly enough. It wasn't inefficient. It wasn't experimental. It wasn't improvisational. It was refined, as if the technology had passed through countless iterations long before it ever arrived here. Bob realized that his role wasn't to recreate the system in full. That expectation was never placed on him. Instead, he was meant to understand it just enough to describe its principles, to map its behavior, to explain what kind of physics would allow something like this to exist. That alone would take years, perhaps decades. And yet, the facility operated with quiet patience. There was no urgency, no looming deadline, no sense that results needed to be delivered quickly. This wasn't a race, it was stewardship. Bob noticed that conversations about the outside world rarely happened. When they did, they felt distant, abstract. News, politics, everyday concerns seemed oddly irrelevant within these walls. The focus here was singular: understand the technology, preserve the secrecy, maintain control. Bob sometimes wondered how many others like him had passed through similar corridors over the years. How many minds had circled the same questions, leaving behind fragments of understanding for the next person to pick up. He also wondered how much of the truth anyone was allowed to see. Because even as his understanding grew, the sense of compartmentalization never faded. Access was granted carefully, information revealed only when it became unavoidable. Bob understood then that his selection wasn't just about his skills. It was about his temperament. He could work without answers, without recognition, without certainty. And that, perhaps more than anything else, was why he had been brought here. Chapter 5. Propulsion. Understanding the craft's movement required Bob to let go of certain habits. Not abandon physics, not ignore mathematics, but loosen the grip on assumptions that had always worked before. In conventional systems, propulsion is about force. Something pushes against something else. Thrust is generated, resistance is overcome, and motion follows a predictable path through space. The craft did none of this. It did not accelerate in the way aircraft or rockets do. There was no buildup of speed, no strain against inertia, no transitional phase between rest and movement. When it moved, it was simply somewhere else. Bob focused on the field. The region directly beneath the craft appeared altered, subtly, but consistently. Instruments placed nearby registered changes that were difficult to describe without slipping into abstraction. Weight behaved differently. Time itself seemed to hesitate, stretching slightly before returning to normal. The craft generated gravity, not passively like a planet or a star, but deliberately, precisely. The field could be shaped, intensified, redirected. Bob thought of it less as propulsion and more as controlled falling. If space could be bent, then falling no longer meant down. It meant inward, toward a point of curvature chosen by the craft. Movement became a matter of rearranging geometry rather than applying force. This explained the silence. No engines meant no sound. No exhaust meant no turbulence. No acceleration meant no sonic boom. The craft didn't fight the universe. It negotiated with it. Bob examined diagrams showing how the gravitational field interacted with the craft's structure. The shape wasn't aesthetic. It wasn't symbolic. It was functional, optimized to distribute stress and maintain stability within the distortion it created. The material itself played a role. Certain components appeared unusually dense, far more so than their size suggested. They responded to the field in ways conventional matter did not, amplifying and stabilizing it rather than resisting it. At the center of the system was the element Bob had heard mentioned before, element 115. Here it was no longer theoretical. It existed as a tangible substance, contained and shielded, its properties carefully controlled. When stimulated, it produced a gravitational effect far beyond anything Bob had previously encountered. The field it generated was not random. It was structured. Bob realized that the propulsion system wasn't a single mechanism, but an integrated whole. The element, the field, the shape of the craft, and its internal configuration all worked together. Removing any one part disrupted the entire system. This wasn't technology built in layers. It was technology grown as a unit. Bob spent long hours studying the behavior of the field under controlled conditions. Small adjustments, minor variations, each test revealing just enough to deepen the mystery without resolving it. Sometimes the results aligned with prediction, other times they didn't. The equations held, but the intuition lagged behind. There was a sense that the system operated within a framework that human physics had only begun to outline. Bob found that unsettling, not because it was impossible, but because it was elegant. The craft obeyed laws, just not the ones humans had grown accustomed to prioritizing. As days turned into weeks, Bob began to understand why progress here was measured differently. Success wasn't defined by breakthroughs or milestones. It was defined by restraint, by learning how not to interfere, by recognizing which questions were premature, by accepting that some systems could be observed without being fully grasped. Bob left the hangar one evening with his thoughts drifting far beyond the facility. The desert outside felt impossibly vast compared to the contained precision within those walls. If this kind of propulsion existed, then distance itself became negotiable. Stars were no longer unreachable points of light. They were destinations waiting for the right geometry. And that realization lingered with Bob long after he returned to the quiet corridors of the facility. Chapter 6. Realization. At some point, without a clear moment to mark it, Bob stopped thinking of the craft as an anomaly. It became a presence, something that simply was, existing quietly within the boundaries of the facility, obeying its own rules without needing to justify them. The longer he worked around it, the less remarkable its existence felt, and that, in its own way, was the most unsettling change of all. Familiarity settled in. Not comfort exactly, but acceptance. Bob noticed it in the way the technicians moved through the hangar, how they adjusted instruments and recorded data with the same steady rhythm they might use for any other system. The craft no longer demanded attention. It commanded it effortlessly. It was never introduced. It was never explained. It simply occupied space. Over time, Bob realized that no one here spoke about origins. Not in passing, not in private. The question of where the craft came from was absent, not avoided, as though it had already been answered and set aside long ago. That absence carried weight, because if the origin was known and no longer discussed, then the implications had already been absorbed into the structure of the project itself. The secrecy, the compartmentalization, the patience. All of it made sense. Bob began to see the facility not as a research lab, but as a boundary, a place where something extraordinary was held carefully apart from the rest of the world, insulated from reaction, interpretation, and consequence. This wasn't about discovery. It was about containment. During one quiet observation session, Bob found himself standing alone near the craft, the hangar lights dimmed to their lowest operational level. The surface absorbed the glow without reflecting it, as if it refused to announce its presence. In that stillness, a thought surfaced that Bob had been unconsciously avoiding. The craft wasn't experimental. It wasn't unfinished. It wasn't waiting for improvement. It was complete. Whatever intelligence had designed it had done so with an understanding of physics that extended far beyond human convention. Not as an abstraction, but as applied reality. The kind of understanding that comes from long familiarity rather than sudden insight. Bob felt a subtle shift in perspective. If this technology existed, then humanity wasn't standing at the edge of the unknown. It was standing somewhere inside it. The work Bob was doing no longer felt like an attempt to catch up. It felt like a translation effort, trying to interpret something that had been written in a language humans were only beginning to recognize. He wondered how many other systems like this might exist. Not just craft, but technologies, principles, entire frameworks of understanding that remained invisible, simply because no one had shown humanity where to look. The thought was neither comforting nor alarming. It was expansive. Bob also became aware of the limits placed around him. Subtle, but unmistakable. Certain questions redirected, certain requests delayed indefinitely. Access granted only when it aligned perfectly with his role. He understood then that knowledge here was not something you pursued. It was something you were allowed, and allowances could be withdrawn. That awareness didn't frighten him. It clarified the environment. It explained the quiet discipline, the careful speech, the absence of speculation. Everyone here was balancing curiosity against responsibility. Bob continued his work with renewed focus, aware that understanding the craft was only one layer of the project. Beneath it lay decisions, priorities, and considerations that extended far beyond the hangar walls. The craft was a key. But Bob began to suspect it wasn't the only one. As he left the hangar that night, the desert air greeted him with its familiar stillness. Above, The stars felt closer than they ever had before. Not because of distance, but because the idea of reaching them no longer seemed abstract. It felt technical, and that realization stayed with him, quietly reshaping the way he saw everything that followed. Chapter 7. Test Flights. Bob first became aware of the test flights through routine, not through announcements or briefings, but through small adjustments to the schedule. Certain nights were suddenly unavailable, certain corridors restricted, certain tasks postponed without explanation. It was subtle, but consistent. Eventually, someone mentioned it in passing, their voice low and unremarkable, as though discussing a weather report. There would be a test that night. Bob wasn't told what would happen, only where he was permitted to stand, and when. Observation was allowed. Participation was not. The desert after sunset was unlike anything Bob had known. Heat lingered in the ground long after the sun disappeared, radiating upward in faint, wavering currents. The air grew still, heavy with anticipation, though nothing about the environment suggested movement. From the observation point, the landscape appeared endless. Flat stretches of pale earth, distant ridgelines dissolving into darkness. The sky above, wide and unbroken, filled with stars that seemed sharper here, untouched by city light. The craft rested on the ground at first. Its surface was barely visible, absorbing what little light remained. There were no external preparations, no crews circling it, no audible systems powering up. It waited. Bob noticed how quiet the area was. Not just the absence of machinery, but the absence of incidental sound. No wind, no insects. Even the faint hum of the facility seemed distant, muffled by the open space. Then the craft moved. There was no warning, no vibration, no sound. It lifted from the ground as if gravity had simply released it. Not upward exactly, but away. The distinction mattered. The craft didn't push itself into the air. It slipped free of its relationship with the surface below. Bob felt a tightening in his chest. The movement was smooth beyond expectation. No wobble, no adjustment. The craft maintained perfect orientation as it rose, hovering briefly above the desert floor. Then it shifted. The transition was instantaneous. One moment it was stationary. The next, it was elsewhere. Not blurred, not streaking, simply repositioned. Bob's eyes struggled to follow it, his perception lagging behind the reality unfolding above him. The craft moved in sharp angles that ignored momentum, stopping and changing direction without deceleration. It traced patterns in the sky that would have torn conventional aircraft apart. The silence was complete. Bob realized that if he hadn't been watching, he would never have known it was there at all. The movement left no trace, no disturbance, no echo. The craft hovered again, suspended against the stars, its outline faint but unmistakable. For a moment, it remained perfectly still. Then it descended. The return was just as controlled as the ascent. The craft settled back onto the desert floor with the same quiet certainty, as though it had never left. No dust was kicked up. No heat shimmer followed. The ground accepted it without resistance. Around Bob, no one spoke. There was no applause, no reaction, no acknowledgement that anything extraordinary had occurred. Data was collected, instruments recorded, notes were taken. The test flight was treated as routine. Bob stood there long after the craft had come to rest, his thoughts moving slowly, deliberately, as though trying not to disturb something fragile. The implications were clear. If such movement could be controlled, then distance ceased to matter. Surveillance became effortless. Travel became trivial. Detection became optional. The craft could appear anywhere, or nowhere at all. As the group dispersed, Bob walked back toward the facility in silence. The desert felt different now. Less empty, more aware. Above him, the stars seemed to shift subtly, not in position, but in meaning. They were no longer distant markers of an unreachable universe. They were coordinates. And Bob understood then that what he had witnessed wasn't a demonstration. It was confirmation. Chapter 8. Pressure. The change didn't arrive all at once. There was no confrontation, no warning delivered in sharp tones, no moment that clearly marked the shift. Instead, it settled in quietly, almost politely, threading itself into Bob's routine until it became impossible to ignore. Access narrowed. Certain rooms were suddenly unavailable. Requests that had once been approved without comment were now met with delays, then silence. Conversations became shorter, more carefully framed, as though everyone had learned to speak within invisible boundaries. Bob noticed it first in the way people avoided eye contact, not out of fear, but caution. The facility had always been controlled, but now it felt observant, present, as if it were listening even when no one appeared to be nearby. Bob became aware of subtle patterns, the same individuals crossing his path more often than coincidence would suggest. The same vehicles parked in the same places, night after night. Nothing overt, nothing provable, just consistency. The sense of being watched was not oppressive, but persistent, like background noise that never quite faded. Bob continued his work. He always did. But the quiet curiosity that had once driven him began to mix with something heavier. A recognition that knowledge here carried weight, and that weight was being carefully measured. There were reminders, casual mentions of security protocols, gentle references to obligations, conversations that drifted without explanation toward the consequences of misunderstanding or miscommunication. No one threatened him. They didn't need to. The environment itself made the expectations clear. Bob began to feel the separation between his life inside the facility and the world beyond it growing wider. Outside concerns felt distant, unreal, as though belonging to a version of himself that no longer fully existed. At times, the silence followed him home. The desert nights, once expansive and open, began to feel enclosed. The stars overhead no longer offered comfort. They felt watched too, fixed points observing from above. Bob noticed changes in his own behavior. He spoke less. He wrote more carefully. He paused before asking questions that once came easily. The work continued, but the atmosphere shifted from exploration to preservation. Understanding the craft was still the goal, but now it was accompanied by an unspoken directive. Do not disrupt the balance. Bob sensed that the project had boundaries not defined by science alone. There were decisions being made elsewhere. Decisions about what could be known and by whom. The craft remained untouched by this tension. It waited, unchanged, indifferent to the human structures forming around it. Its presence was steady, unaffected by pressure or perception. That contrast unsettled Bob. The technology itself felt neutral, honest, its behavior consistent, its principles reliable. The secrecy surrounding it was not. Bob found himself reflecting more often during quiet moments, not questioning the reality of what he had seen, but considering the cost of carrying it forward. Some knowledge demanded containment, not because it was dangerous in itself, but because of how it could be used. The thought lingered as Bob moved through the facility, aware now that the walls around him served more than one purpose. They protected something extraordinary, and they ensured that those who encountered it would not forget where the limits were. Chapter 9. Speaking Out. Bob did not leave the facility with a sense of resolution. There was no closing conversation, no moment where everything was explained or neatly contained. His work simply slowed, then stopped, as though the project had gently exhaled him back into the world. Outside the desert, life resumed its familiar shape. Traffic, conversations, everyday concerns that once felt solid now carried a strange lightness, as if they belonged to a different scale of reality. Bob carried what he had seen quietly. For a time, that silence felt manageable. The knowledge remained compartmentalized, just as it had been inside the facility. Something kept separate, carefully handled. But silence has weight, and over time, that weight begins to shift. Bob became aware that the story he held wasn't fading. It wasn't softening into memory or doubt. If anything, it remained remarkably clear, resisting reinterpretation. The details stayed fixed, unchanged by distance or repetition. That steadiness mattered. Eventually, Bob spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, simply and without ornament. When his account reached the public, it did not arrive with explanation or proof neatly packaged for understanding. It arrived as a disruption, a quiet contradiction to what most people assumed was possible. The reaction was immediate. Attention gathered, speculation followed. The name of a place few had heard before began to circulate, carrying with it an entirely new set of associations. Area 51. What had once been an obscure location became a symbol, a placeholder for secrecy, advanced technology, and unanswered questions. The desert took on a new meaning in the public imagination, shaped by the possibility that something extraordinary might be hidden just beyond view. Bob watched this unfold from a distance. He did not revise his story to fit expectations. He didn't expand it to satisfy curiosity. He allowed it to remain exactly as it was. That consistency became its own presence. Years passed. The world changed in countless ways, yet the core of Bob's account remained the same. The craft, the facility, the physics that didn't behave as expected. Nothing about it softened with time. Bob understood that speaking out hadn't been an attempt to convince. It had been an act of alignment, a refusal to carry something so significant entirely alone. Whether others accepted it or not was secondary. What mattered was that the story now existed outside the walls that had once contained it. The craft, wherever it was, remained silent. The technology did not announce itself. It did not demand recognition. It continued to exist beyond reach, indifferent to belief or disbelief. And perhaps that was the most enduring aspect of the story. Not that something extraordinary had been discovered, but that it had been quietly present all along, waiting to be noticed. As the night settles and the world grows still, the desert remains vast and unchanged. Somewhere beneath that open sky, questions linger without urgency, suspended in the same patient way the craft once hovered above the ground. Unresolved, unrushed, simply there. And in that quiet space between knowing and not knowing, it becomes easier to let the mind rest.